It's 3 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I hope you had a lovely weekend. I don't know about you, felt more springy today. It did in my part of the world anyway. I'm not sure where you are. But I get a bit lighter in the mornings. It makes such a difference to your general sense of well-being and being at one with the universe. And then, of course, you remember the news and it all comes crashing down around you. A bit of a difference today from recent days. I don't have anything new to say or indeed to ask you about the unfolding horrors in Ukraine. I think we're now playing a game of wait and see what happens next. But lots of attendant issues continue to concern us. Chiefly, I think, the cost of living that is, it was already going to be a catastrophic crisis, and situation in Ukraine is going to make that measurably worse. What that means for I'm going to use the word normal. I hate the phrase ordinary people when it's used in that sort of odd context, ordinary people. There's not really any such thing as an ordinary person. We are all extraordinary in our own different ways. But by normal people, obviously I'm referring to a sort of median, an average, a mean. The idea that if you are not very comfortable, extraordinarily comfortable, abnormally comfortable, then people are going to start. People who rarely feel their pips squeak, or possibly have never felt their pips squeak, are, I think, in the coming months going to feel their pips squeak. And it was really brought home to me when I stepped onto the Piccadilly line this morning. I wonder whether she's listening, whether she knew that the weird bloke in a baseball cap and a face mask was earwigging to her conversation with, I think, a colleague. And she said, what are they going... I said, I even wrote it down. That's how weird I am, because I wanted to get the words exactly right. Sometimes the immediacy of the moment can get lost if I try and remember it. And, me, I'd probably insert a word with 14 syllables when it wasn't really needed. So she simply said, how are people going to pay if they just don't have the money? And then she added, and in case anyone listening to this right now is wondering, was that me? Was he listening to me? You will now know for certain that it was you, because she then added, we've moved to the cheapest cat food. We've already moved to the cheapest cat food. And in a way that perhaps newspaper headlines can't. That just hit me. We'll get onto that later in the programme. Because another thing that's hit me, and I think it's still trending on Twitter for what that's worth, is the story of Evgeny Lebedev, the son of a KGB spy who spent the best part of a decade ingratiating himself, to use the words of yesterday's Sunday Times, with the British establishment, and signed up many, many politicians to help him in that quest. Now, I choose my words quite carefully, because obviously, there are, and I should stress that Evgeny Lebedev wrote a lengthy article for the Evening Standard newspaper, which he owns, on Friday, denying any allegations of impropriety or links to Putin and all the rest of it. There's a photograph. I don't know if you've seen it. There's an incredible photograph from Evgeny Lebedev's summer party a couple of years ago. It would probably be 2019, would it, given that I don't think anyone had summer parties in 2020 or 2021. You may have caught a sniff of it because Lily Allen went and in inimitable fashion sort of started taking pictures over her shoulder and going, look at that, Rupert Murdoch sitting next to Nigel Farage and all that kind of thing. And I guess Lily's presence there, an indication of how many people from the world of show business and what have you also got caught up in Lebedev's drive to the heart of British society, Elton John being a particularly close pal by all accounts. But there's one photograph, you may have noticed it because of the shoes that are being worn by at least 2 out of 3 of the characters in the photograph, and it features a very chummy-looking Rupert Murdoch, Evgeny Lebedev, and Nigel Farage. Farage there, of course, as a sort of court jester, or as a, if you like, a kind of, what would the word be? Useful idiot, perhaps, is the kindest way of putting it. What was really interesting about the Sunday Times coverage yesterday was it means that Murdoch has kind of cut Lebedev loose. Murdoch's calculations are legendary, of course, because he still owns Fox News, and Fox News has presenters on it that are essentially firing distraction for Vladimir Putin. There's a couple of presenters on Fox News who might as well be on the Kremlin payroll, such as their analysis, for want of a better word, of the situation in Ukraine. So you have this incredible sense, and it's happened under our noses now for so long that we don't really notice it. You kind of put a few quid on every horse. Do you remember those machines in the fair when we were kids. They're probably still there. I haven't seen them for a while. But there'd be horse races, like a mechanical horse race. And when you're a kid, you're convinced, or I was a strange kid, you're convinced that there must be, that you can hack it or crack it, that there's a code that you can crack. And you put a tuppenny piece, you put tuppence on a slot. There's 6 slots with different odds, right? And you put tuppence on a slot, and obviously if your horse comes in, it pays out. And the longer the odds, the bigger the payout. You know how betting works. But I always had this idea that there must be a way to put 2p on every slot and make a profit. Obviously you can't, but I always think of that when I look at media ownership, particularly Rupert Murdoch, because he'll have the Times writing relatively, well, it's sometimes incredibly brilliant journalism. It employs some of the finest journalists in this country. And then there'll also be people writing under his stable, most obviously for The Sun, who are completely toxic and profoundly deceitful. Imagine owning several newspapers and having some of them come out in favour of Brexit and some of them come out against it. We talk a lot on the programme about politicians shouting heads and tails as they toss a coin into the air and then doing a lap of honour however it lands. I don't think he does that. I think he has a pretty clear idea about what he wants, but he can avoid being blatant about it because if he's got his populist newspaper to come out in favour of something, he can protect his so-called respectability or credibility by getting his intellectual newspaper to come out against something. And it almost adds to the problem because all those bloody experts on the Times saying that Brexit's going to be a bad idea get drowned out by all the yobbos on the Sun. This is the kind of reading of the situation. It's not what I believe. Well, it is what I believe about the columnists. It's not what I believe about the readers. You get them to drown out the clever lads and lasses on the Times by shouting the odds in the pages of the Sun. So I don't know whether decisions like this reach all the way up to the top of the empire, but it seems unlikely to me that the Sunday Times would pull Evgeny Lebedev's past to pieces in yesterday's pages without the permission of the boss, the proprietor, Rupert Murdoch. So that photograph with Rupert Murdoch, Evgeny Lebedev and Nigel Farage all sort of guffawing at a summer party thrown by the Russian oligarch, it seems to me to be a picture for the ages. It might be a picture that appears in books. It might be a picture that appears in history books, because it was also reported in the Sunday Times yesterday that Evgeny Lebedev was either at or hosted, I can't remember which, a dinner party at which he sought to persuade Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, both attending with their then wives, both marriages, for what it's worth, now over, both attending with their then wives. He sought to persuade Boris Johnson and Michael Gove to publicly come out in favour of Brexit. Quite what qualified him to make that sort of intervention at one of the highest levels of British politics, I don't know, apart from money and access. But I found that remarkable. And remember, this appeared in Rupert Murdoch's Sunday Times, which I'm not suggesting makes it true, but it certainly makes it credible given the background of all the characters and the links previously between them. It also, I think, makes a pretty powerful case for suggesting that Murdoch has decided to cut Lebedev loose in the same way that the British government has decided to cut Roman Abramovich loose, despite the fact that perhaps more prominent oligarchs, or certainly oligarchs whose links with the Conservative Party are clearer, remain unsanctioned. And don't forget, the co-chairman of the Conservative Party, a chap called Ben Elliott, who's the nephew of Camilla Parker Bowles, still on the Russian version of his company's concierge company's website, boasts about all the favours they can do for super rich Russians. They've removed the English language version, but hey-ho, business is business. So 12 minutes after 10 is the time. I have this occasional problem on the programme. I've mentioned it to you in the past. No, not that one, Keith. The other one. I've mentioned it to you in the past that the difference between a story and a topic. Sometimes the biggest stories in the news don't lend themselves to our conversations together. They don't, to be simplistic about it, they don't make good phone-ins. But when I'm in a particularly obtuse mood, I like to do a topic on asking whether a topic is a topic, or asking whether a story is actually a topic. So, in a sense, it's a question of whether or not something is cutting through. But rather than working out whether it's cutting through and deciding whether to talk about it according to the question or the answer to the question of whether or not it's cutting through, I'd like to ask you whether you think it's cutting through, which means really I'm asking you whether you care. The newspaper owner spent a decade eager to ingratiate himself with the British establishment, with the politician as a willing partner, the politician in this case being Boris Johnson. And now at 10:13 we come to the kicker. Boris Johnson learnt that British intelligence had warned against granting a peerage to his close friend Evgeny Lebedev on national security grounds. I'll say that again. On March the 17th, 2020, Boris Johnson learnt that British intelligence had warned against granting a peerage to his close friend Evgeny Lebedev on national security grounds. Now, what follows, and John Sweeney, not for the first time, is quite far ahead of the pack on this, but what follows is a very detailed account of what happened next. And what happened next was that Johnson demanded evidence of impropriety, and of course there isn't any. What intelligence services advise on cases like this is the wisdom moving forward of putting somebody, an identified individual, in this case Evgeny Lebedev, the son of a former KGB agent, putting them in the House of Lords. So Johnson demands a smoking gun. The head of MI6, John Sawes, responds by saying, reportedly, that's not really how it works. We, MI6, are more troubled by the wider risk that Evgeny Lebedev may pose. He'd already tried to set up a lunch with the head of MI6 as a consequence of being the owner of the Independent newspaper. So these tentacles strike me as almost unbelievably wriggly. I want to know how they strike you. So there are two questions today. Does this matter? 0345 60 60973. Or, to be really brutal, do you care? I really think you should, but I don't know that I can make you. I'll say that again. This man was put in the House of Lords after Boris Johnson essentially dismissed warnings from his own security services that they didn't think he should be put in the House of Lords. That's the nicest and kindest and most libel lawyer-friendly way I can find of putting it. The security services didn't think he should be put in the House of Lords. Boris Johnson, one of the first things he did after getting into Downing Street, pressed on anyway. So question number one, does this matter? Surely it matters. Why does it matter? Question number two, 0345 60 60973. I don't think anyone would imagine for a moment that Boris Johnson's on the payroll of Evgeny Lebedev, although another story popped up this weekend or got resurrected this weekend about how the Daily Telegraph, where Boris Johnson used to earn £250,000 a year as a columnist, was making about £500,000 a year printing what could be loosely described as propaganda for the Russian government. That's all disappeared from the Daily Telegraph's website now. It's crazy, right? So does this matter? And the question I'm really interested in, and I don't know whether I'm posh enough to answer this. I'm clearly not posh enough to answer this, and I'm not famous enough either. I'm not of a sufficient celebrity level to be invited to these parties, and I'm not posh enough really to understand how the wheels turn in these sort of circles. How does it happen? How can a fellow who's the son of a KGB spy end up pulling so many strings in the British establishment that one of his former protégés now presents the Today programme on Radio 4. He owns 2 British newspapers, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom ignored his own security services concerns to put him in the House of Lords. I'll allow myself a mild profanity. How the hell does that happen? 0345 60 60973 is the number that you need. It's 10:17. 20 minutes after 10, and I should have added, in addition to John Sweeney, that the Sunday Times' excellent investigation yesterday also followed fast upon a superb investigation by Paul Caruana Galizia for the splendid Tortoise website, and we'll be speaking to Paul later in the programme. So it's hard to know where to start. Carol Cadwallader, again, somebody whose work in this field has been, we could say not quite ignored, but certainly reported for a long time. She's more interested in a meeting that Boris Johnson had in the immediate aftermath of the Skripal poisonings than she is in the actual peerage, the elevation of Evgeny Lebedev to the House of Lords. She points out that Boris Johnson, as Foreign Secretary, went somewhere with Evgeny, and who were to turn up but Evgeny's father, Alexander, a former KGB agent, believed still to have links to the Kremlin, although when they first settled in London, very few questions were asked about where their money had come from, but there was a sense that he was perhaps a critic of the Kremlin or somehow fleeing Vladimir Putin. I don't think that is widely believed anymore. So how does this happen? And why does it matter? 0345 6060 I hope these aren't stupid questions. We'll soon find out. Andy's in Chipping Campden. Andy, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James. I just wanted to say thank you as well for the job that you're doing at the moment. I just would say it does matter. I do care. I'm not a great political thinker. I've never been that politically aware.
Sure.
But I am sort of watching the destruction of this country.
Does it really feel like that to you?
It does. It feels as though we're being destroyed, shredded, stamped on.
Sold.
And if you look... sold, definitely.
Possibly.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And looking back and reading Carol's work as well, you can almost see the point where Putin identified the opportunity and the case to destroy this country and preferably the EU as well, by choosing the weakest people that they could buy, the ones that they could influence, I don't know whether the Eton crowd, if you like.
Steering it back to Evgeny Lebedev, it's not just politicians. Hadley Freeman, the brilliant Guardian writer, reports this morning that she used to do the Evening Standard Awards, and pretty much every actor that got on stage to receive a gong would refer to Darling Evgeny and make a reference to his Umbrian palazzo. Now, it's not the job of an actor to do due diligence on a bloke sponsoring an award ceremony or inviting them on holiday.
Actors are vain, aren't they? So they want to be linked to the next.
Yeah, don't forget Volodymyr Zelensky is a lovey as well. So it's not quite the open goal that it used to be for right-wing idiots that attack on. So it's not. I don't think anybody is kind of trousering illegal payments or anything like that. And the likes of you and I generally are never going to get invited to parties like this. But it gives him an air of authority and credibility, which means people won't be questioning it. And you stick him in the House of Lords, there's barely an actor on the planet who's going to go, hang on a minute, they've put him in the House of Lords. He must be all right. It's
all back patting and friendliness and, what they can channel and get to know. Yeah, definitely. I do think that years ago, he is just one of the characters who could sort of build this spider's web of destruction over this country. And
little fractures, perhaps. I think you might be right, because the line in the story that jumped out at me yesterday was the dinner party at which he sought to persuade Boris Johnson and Michael Gove to support Brexit. And I stress again, because I do understand, I know how it works. Some people will be desperate to think that this isn't true. I stress again, this is in Rupert Murdoch's Sunday Times. So, why on earth would he make it up is the question that you need to answer if you're priming yourself to start poo-pooing this on the grounds of it being something that you don't want to believe. Then you need to tell me, why would Rupert Murdoch amplify this? And, of course, the reason I mentioned John Sweeney and Carol Cadwallader, as Andy referred to, and Paul Karuna Galizia, whose investigation possibly preempted the Sunday Times investigation, is the very simple reason that something has changed. The facts haven't really changed. He didn't get put in the Lords last week, but Putin's behaviour in Ukraine has just turned up the volume on noise that has been bubbling away in the background now for some years. And prominent among that noise is now the question of how could this fellow have ended up so high up in British society? He owns 2 newspapers. Answer, well, you don't exactly have to be squeaky clean to own a newspaper in this country. All right, then. He sits in the House of Lords despite the fact that our own intelligence services suggested that he shouldn't be allowed anywhere near the House of Lords. Sunday Times also had an unusually explicit letter sent by Boris Johnson to Evgeny Lebedev saying that he would be thrilled if Lebedev's newspapers, the Evening Standard, which of course for a London mayor is a very big deal, and the Independent could cover some of his mayoral projects, saying his team was all set to make a presentation to Geordie, who was the editor, with whom he had also lunched weeks earlier. 10:25 is the time. Jasbinder is in Hampstead. Jasbinder, what would you like to say?
James, hi. In answer to your question, does it matter? My view is that it does matter, or at very least it should matter. And I think it's up to individuals such as yourself, credit to Carol Cadwallader, and now you've mentioned her a few times already, for sticking to her guns despite everything all the opprobrium that
So what's changed then? Well, I mean, is it just the invasion of Ukraine has made everybody go, whoa, we better clean out the corridors? Because nothing's really changed in the context of the intelligence advice, the parties, the slipping the security detail when he was at the Palazzo in Umbria, the inveigling or infiltrating the highest levels of British society. Tony Blair, Peter Mandelson, Stephen Fry have been at some of his parties. So what's changed?
I think what has changed for an increasing number of people is the conversations that the likes of yourself are having are starting to lift the fog from all of those individual elements that weren't visible, are becoming increasingly visible, and people are more easily able to join the dots between the inputs, the outputs, and the outcomes.
So why does it matter then? Why does it matter? Why should people care? There's no suggestion of criminality. There's no suggestion of corruption.
No.
Not explicit corruption.
They're good at what they do. Is why there's no suggestion of any of that. That doesn't necessarily make it right. And I think where it didn't matter, there's a line between where it didn't matter, which has now been crossed, and it didn't matter when it was a conversation to individuals on the street, to people on the tube that you may be earwigging on.
Yes.
Now, it didn't matter when it was funding for UKIP. It doesn't matter, when questions are asked about funding for GB News. It doesn't really matter about funding even for Conservative parties, because they've got a ready retort around union funding.
And they're all as bad as each other. I mean, that's the other ready retort, isn't it? It doesn't need to be true. It just needs to fit.
Yeah, it doesn't matter when you go into a newsagent and you look at the Telegraph, the Independent and Standard, and you realise that they're ultimately owned with money from sort of dubious, questionable sources. It doesn't matter that the Russia report has been suppressed. It doesn't matter that the press room was refitted by a company headquartered in Russia. It honestly probably doesn't even matter about the peerage, because that whole system is a busted flush. Where that line became blurred between doesn't and does matter was Brexit, but the connections weren't visible because of that fog. And does it stop at Brexit? No, because...
But you need to take people with you who are still happy with Brexit, Jasbinder. And I say that with a heavy heart, but you have to make this matter to people who don't want to hear about whether or not Brexit was in any way dodgy.
But the dots were all there to be joined. And going forward, it will be net zero. But where it does matter, and you've talked about cat food as your example, is energy. It does matter when you talk about security as well. So if you just landed on those two topics, that matters to pretty much everybody at the moment, whether it's framed as a cost of living crisis, whether it's framed as are we doing enough from a refugee perspective, another topic that you've talked about over the past few days, understandably.
Once we're going to run out of time for the news, I disagree with you. I could well be wrong, but I don't think those dots will ever be joined. I think the only dot that's been joined is the notion of watching just how vile Putin is now on Europe's doorstep and thinking, how the hell could we have been in bed with any of his mates?
That narrative would play into Johnson's narrative, which is that's just anti-Russia. Anything to do with Russia is wrong.
But that's falling apart. That's my point. That's obviously falling apart because most of the British public have completely reviewed their opinion on refugees, to use your example, as a direct consequence of something being different about Putin's conduct in Ukraine compared to, for example, Putin's conduct in Syria. So whether or not this has got legs, we will see. I agree with pretty much everything else you said, and the problem is that we're talking about Boris Johnson, so it doesn't matter how big the scandal is. How many times do I have to tell you? He'll try and ride it out. He'll deny, he'll obfuscate, he'll change his story, he'll claim it's not a story at all, and he'll just hope that something else comes along to overshadow the events. In the case of the parties and the probable or the alleged law-breaking for which he's still under police caution, it's a bloody great war has come along and given him the opportunity to pretend that somehow doesn't matter anymore. I wish that analysis wasn't unerringly accurate and constantly proven correct, but it is. So will this be one big enough not to be overshadowed, not to be overtaken, not to be drowned out by the noise of his cheerleaders, which does make me wonder whether the fact that Murdoch sanctioned this article in the Sunday Times yesterday may turn out to be significant. 10:31 is the time. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. 10:35 is the time. So, I mean, you're going back a few years, but in an interview with our now colleague Andrew Marr when he worked somewhere else, Used to be in Shepherd's Bush, can't remember what it's called. On the question of the invasion of Crimea, Evgeny Lebedev, Boris Johnson's close friend and confidant, said Crimea had been for many years part of Russia and only recently part of Ukraine. The subject was very complicated, and that Russia has reached out to the West. I think now is the time to stop Cold War rhetoric on both sides. He also said that he didn't think Russia would be making any further incursions into any land. And also, once again, talking about a completely ridiculous referendum that was used to justify the annexation, or the occupation, rather, of Crimea. He said, even though I would say that the referendum may not have been held under the right circumstances, I think the outcome of the vote would be the same. So it's pretty ugly, I think. Marina Litvinenko, who I know, I should probably mention that for reasons of full disclosure, the widow of Alexander Litvinenko, who was murdered by Russian spies in London in 2013, has responded to the fact that Lebedev shared an article about Litvinenko, which was written by a writer he employed, saying Russia's complicity in his murder is still far from proven. He also promoted an article that I think was in the Daily Mail, suggesting that there may still be doubt surrounding the involvement of Russian spies in that murder. Spoiler alert, there isn't. But there it is. And Marina Litvinenko told the Sunday Times in January 2015, the public inquiry started and every material was heard during this public inquiry. It would be in the public domain. You cannot ignore this. Do you believe this was MI6 or not? Lebedev needs to answer yes or no, or apologise for what he did say. And when she was asked whether this peerage should be reviewed, as Sir Keir Starmer has called for, she said, I think it should because I disagreed from the very beginning of this. It should not be explained as Russophobia. That was the point Jasbinder made. That's what Johnson will try and call it. Already has, of course. Of course, I am against any Russophobe action, as she would be, what with being Russian and everything. So I got the question slightly wrong, not for the first time. It's not does this matter, it's does this matter to you? You personally. And if not, why not? 0345 6060973. I don't want to be rude. I'm not unintentionally. I'm quite happy to be rude, but I try to make sure I'm doing it on purpose. But if you are still signed up to this lot, how do you make sense of this one? How do you dismiss this one? You know, the fact that he was partying while you couldn't go to your friends' funerals, you've managed to dismiss that. You've swallowed some nonsense line about crisps and Prosecco, the fact that you spent your whole life claiming to uphold Christian values or care about family values, and you've ended up with a leader who rides roughshod over all of that on a daily basis. You're somehow managing to process the fact that an island with a sea border, because of appalling leadership, didn't manage to come out of the coronavirus crisis measurably better than all the other countries in Europe that don't have sea borders, closing airports, stopping for all the obvious things that could have been done and weren't done. That's all under control. I get how you can just about excuse all of that. All politicians are liars. They're all as bad as each other. Well, at least Jeremy Corbyn wasn't elected. What about the Iraq war? I know all the arguments, all the lines. I would love to know if you fancy giving me a ring. And I almost missed the days when you did. I would love to know how do you square this one? How do you tie the knot in your scarf to stop the blood getting to your brain on this one? On Boris Johnson overruling his own security services to give a peerage to a bloke who sits in the House of Lords despite being the son of a KGB spy. And what do you think Vladimir Putin did when Evgeny Lebedev was anointed Lord of Siberia, sitting in the House of Lords in the United Kingdom under the title Lord of Siberia? What do you think the reaction to that was in the Kremlin? 10:39 is the time. So does this matter to you? If so, why? 034560060973. And a little bit more in hope than expectation. If not, why not? Because apart from having a cultish devotion to Boris Johnson, I can't see how anybody could listen to these details, learn these facts, and not be absolutely flabbergasted, at the very least, and downright disgusted, at the most. Paul's in Newport. Paul, what do you think?
It's almost like we need the equivalent of a Senate Oversight Committee for our government.
Yes.
Because effectively, and I'm talking of England...
Well, we kind of used to have an independent advisor on standards, didn't we? But and on paper we still do, but that has not exactly worked well in the last couple of years.
Yeah, well, volunteers sat in radio stations take two steps forward, please. England's a two-party state, and going back to what you mentioned earlier, so you've got the old Etonians and big business on one side. Boris is handing out this, handing out that, handing out the other, doing favours, contracts here, contracts there, versus, and I know what you said about Corbyn, and I dare I say, I personally still think we're better off not having had him.
Yes, of course you can say that.
But then, with that two-party state, you've got Boris and the old Etonians and big business with their newspapers on their side, and then you've got...
Just let me steer you back to the question of why the Lebedev story matters to you, Paul.
Because it just smacks of more of the same, doesn't it? And that's why I started.
Well, it clearly does. I mean, I'm marking everybody's homework today. But the whole point of this phone-in is that it clearly isn't more of the same. This is clearly different. This is clearly distinct. Not least because Rupert Murdoch has let two of his finest journalists off the leash to dig right into the bottom of this incredible relationship. So it's not more of the same. Or if it is more of the same, why is this now getting the full treatment in a way that it hadn't up until really last week, except with people like John Sweeney, who's often swimming against the tide, Carol Cadwallader, who's often swimming against the tide, and Paul Karuna Galizia at Tortoise, who only really published his investigation a couple of weeks ago. What's changed?
Somebody's agenda has changed, and it's always about agenda. So, as I said, you've got the Tories with old Etonians and big business. And
you keep saying that. I don't want to sound impatient,
yeah, but so the opposite to that,
yes,
is the Labour Party, the unions, and their newspapers, and they're all peddling their own agendas. So, do we need a proper oversight committee, like a Senate oversight committee?
No, I mean you asked that question at the outset, and you ask it again at the end. Gus is in Camden. Gus, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello,
fantastic show, and I'm so pleased you're covering this subject. Yes, it matters. Of course it matters, because it's at the fundamental core of, are we a democracy or not? If we're a democracy, then this really shouldn't be happening. I'm quite angry at myself, to be honest with you, after this weekend, because I've been aware of this, and I haven't let it worry me, and I think I haven't let it worry me.
Same. Don't beat yourself up. I'm guilty too, and I do this for a living. I haven't let it worry
me because there's been so much other stuff to worry about.
Yes.
You know, and in the great pile of things, it hasn't really registered. What I think's happened is that a massive spotlight called the war in Ukraine, has actually been cast upon this whole setup. With the connections to Putin. Yes, it matters.
The oligarchs, the donors, I mean, it's everything, isn't it? And Lebedev, in a way, has sort of emerged as the emblem of it all, in a way, because he's so public and he's so in plain sight.
We've all been aware of it. We've all known it's been going on. But I think what's actually fundamentally changed now is that people feel that there will actually be change off the back of this. If this was the United States, Johnson would be impeached already.
Possibly. I mean, Trump was, not that it came to much, but I mean, some of the questions that remain unanswered are epic, aren't they? They're absolutely enormous. Most obviously, the slipping his security when he attended. We went every year for 5 years to a party in Italy, a Christmas party in Italy, and on one occasion reportedly slipped his security. National security grounds.
We should be fair and non-football scarf about it, okay? You know, for example, you know, at the same Christmas parties, you know, for example, Sadiq Khan was there.
Yes, of course.
You know, so
Tony Blair, Peter Mandelson. I don't know if did Sadiq Khan go to Italy, or was that a different Christmas party?
I don't know that he did. So you know, I only
doesn't
know
matter.
That he
I mean, this is the bit, isn't
London.
it? This is the bit that we have to. I don't know how we negotiate this after years of binary tribal internecine warfare. It's that objective reality, the bits we can all agree on, which have been very thin on the ground, very few and far between in recent years. But we should all be able to agree that something here just doesn't sound right. It sounds absolutely rancid. It sounds rotten. And I think part of the explanation is the one you just touched upon, is that you'd look around, and even if you had a slight vague feeling, hang on a minute, his dad was a KGB spy. Where did the money come from? How can a former spy end up being a billionaire? But then you look around the room and you say, well, hang on. Stevie's here and Tony's here and Boris is here and everybody's here. It must be all right. It must be. And they're all doing it to each other. It's Emperor's New Clothes a bit, isn't it? And no one, except arguably Lily Allen at this summer party and a bloke called Nimrod Kamo who was tweeting his filming of it. Nobody actually stood up and said, hello, there's a naked emperor over there, lads. There's a naked emperor.
Yeah. But, let's look forward and be positive about it, James. Hopefully, and I am hopeful. I'll play back to you something that I heard on your show.
Oh, Lord.
One of your callers once recently said to you that the Irish never forget, the English never remember. I hope that we can all, as a nation, embrace our inner Irishman and not forget this.
I don't know whether this blows the theory up or not, but I'd forgotten that.
Well, there you go. Stop being so English.
Exactly what I was thinking. 10:45 is the time. It is 10 minutes to 11. So just to pick up on a couple of other things that I'm going to share with you. It was in early 2016, with the EU referendum approaching, that Lebedev was present for the evening when Johnson invited Michael Gove to his Islington home, and the pair, in company of their wives Marina and Sarah, decided to back Brexit. He was there as they dined and drank. He's also alleged by two sources to have subsequently tried to persuade Sarah Sands, who was the editor of his newspaper, the Evening Standard, to back leaving the EU as well. She apparently refused. A lot of what was in the Sunday Times yesterday first saw the light of day in Paul Caruana Galicia's investigation for Tortoise. He's a reporter there and a host of the Tortoise Slow News podcast, looking into how Evgeny Lebedev became a House of Lords member despite that security services advice. And Paul joins me now. I know he's just stepped off an aeroplane at Heathrow, so we're particularly grateful to you, Paul, for finding the time. If I was trying to shock somebody into listening to your podcast, I'm not sure I would know where to start. So rich in detail and revelation, is it? Where would you start if you were tasked with that role?
It is such an extraordinary story, but the funny thing about it is Evgeny Lebedev was hiding in plain sight for close to 2 decades, and when this story was commissioned a bit before Christmas, we thought it might just be a profile of a really, really elusive, really strange figure. And we said, let's start at the beginning. And the beginning for Evgeny was this unbelievable party at Althorpe House, Sir Princess Diana's childhood home, where he invited all the great and the good from politics, theatre, film. And it was just the strangest event. And it marked Evgeny's entry, I suppose, into the British establishment and society. But like you say, along the way, there are all these really weird, really worrying moments. So the point when he became obsessed with bullfighting, which was quite fun. But then the worrying moments. So his closeness, his father's closeness to the Kremlin, and then in turn to British politicians.
He's clearly also, and this is something I haven't perhaps picked up on this morning, he's clearly very likeable and charismatic.
I think he's fun, and we spoke to a lot of people who worked with him. He's got this private office full of journalists who write articles under his byline, media advisors and so on. And because he is really odd, they find themselves doing things like arranging a bullfighting lesson or flying around on his private jet. And in a way, it's very good at distracting people from what really matters, which is he the whole time was writing articles either explicitly or in a kind of roundabout way that supported Putin. Supported Putin in Syria, supported Putin after the annexation of Crimea, and when you look back on these pieces, you think it's just incredible that we never really challenged him on it.
What about the security services advice to Boris Johnson and I think the word possibly is passion that Boris Johnson displayed in pursuing a peerage for his clearly very close friend and confidant?
Yes, so the kind of peak, I suppose, of their friendship. Right, this is the amazing thing. So 14 fast years from that party at Althorpe, Evgeny Lebedev was in the House of Lords. He went from a real nobody, a London party boy, to a member of the Lords. Now, what we know through the reporting and work done by other people, like Karel Cadwallader, Luke Harding, and John Sweeney in particular, is that when Evgeny's name went to the House of Lords Appointments Commission, the commissioners asked the security services for advice. The advice they got, so in mid-late March 2020, right at the start of the pandemic, was that they shouldn't make the appointment, that the security services feel very uncomfortable about it, really because of Alexander, Evgeny's father, who was a KGB officer and maintains close links with people from that world, so a whole network of former KGB officers. So they wrote to the Prime Minister saying, we don't think this is a good idea. Please make an alternative nomination. The Prime Minister was furious, wanted to know, how, in summary, he could get around the advice. So he had it watered down and sent Evgeny's name right back to the Commission a couple of days later. And the Commission felt obliged to make the appointment. So they signed off on it, but very reluctantly. And in signing off on it, it should be said that they asked the Prime Minister to take the Russia report, so this Intelligence and Security Committee in Parliament that had produced a report on Russian influence in Britain. They asked Boris Johnson to look at that report, consider its findings very seriously and put them to work, which he never did, of course. He never did. So we ended up with the son of a KGB officer in the House of Lords, and this report on Russian interference in British politics just sitting there.
And one thing we do know from it is that the effort to find any evidence of interference in the referendum result in particular, or the referendum process in particular, is absent because absolutely no effort was made to find any. But as you say, the rest of the report, much of the rest of the report remains shrouded in secrecy. I'm not defending Boris Johnson, but obviously. But he's far from alone. George Osborne, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, took a job as editor of the Evening Standard. There's footage on YouTube of Elton John shaving off Lebedev's beard for comic relief. I mean, everywhere you go, pretty much you'll find someone who's benefited from his largesse, shall we say.
So that's right. And for us, or for me anyway, the story was as much about Britain as Russia and how ready the British establishment, by which I mean the politicians, right? Like you say, George Osborne, but also Tony Blair, who went to this villa in Umbria that the Lebedevs own, and all their other parties, Peter Mandelson. It's really a cross-party thing. The actors, the people from the theatre world, the singers, all of them, all of them were so ready to welcome the Lebedevs. And, maybe there was little to sort of put them off it. But I think we all knew throughout this period about Alexander, the father, and how he made his money and what his past was.
When did it shift? When did the perception shift of him being somebody who was either critical of the Kremlin or fleeing the Kremlin? Because that was, I think, part of the process of getting into society, getting into
That's right.
Britain.
So there's this really extraordinary moment where Alexander Lebedev, who was in 2008 in Moscow, owned a lot of Gazprom and also bought sort of liberal-leaning Russian media outlets. One of them was a tabloid that in 2008 reported allegations that Putin was having an affair with a young gymnast and was about to leave his wife for her. Within a couple of days, that outlet was shut down, and Alexander Lebedev came to London looking for safety. So it was in that year, again 2008, that the Lebedevs started the process to buy the Evening Standard, and then after that, within a few months, bought the Independent. But we speak to a lot of people about this line that oligarchs have to walk between loyalty to Putin and maintaining a sort of pro-Western liberal image, on the other hand, to get themselves into the establishment of whatever country they're in this case Britain, obviously. But then, from that point, he started this, I suppose, campaign to get back in with Putin, to rebuild the relationship. And it became very clear after the annexation of Crimea. So Alexander Lebedev owns a hotel there, and he used to actually fly people out. So he used to fly actors, politicians, socialites from this country to Crimea to spend a few nights at his hotel there. After the annexation, he went sort of full Russia. He wanted to compare the annexation to, say, a referendum, like the Scottish referendum for independence. Hosted a conference there called Open Your Eyes, said the West has misunderstood the situation, and so on and so on. So all the kind of Kremlin arguments in support of the annexation.
Finally, a slightly odd question, perhaps, but as you dug into this, and it's an incredibly detailed and wide-ranging piece of work that I recommend everybody should listen to, did you come to an appreciation of why people accept the invitations? Was it just like the biggest party in town and you'd be mad to miss it kind of thing? Would you have gone? Would you have gone?
Would I have gone? Let me be completely honest and say yes.
Yes. There it is. Sounds incredible.
I mean, the Auto Party was, it sounds like it was out of this world, right? Yeah. They spent, in today's money, £2 million on a single party. And it was meant to raise money for charity. How much did they raise? £500,000 less, because they spent so much money on dancers and acrobats. They had a troupe of Cossacks ride in on horses from the woods around the estate. And then when they got to the party, they did a kind of equestrian ballet, it was called.
Wow.
So really, really over the top.
Yeah.
And that's one reason. I think over time it became about proximity to power, as Evgeny became closer to people like Boris Johnson and Osborne and Mandelson and Blair, people wanted to find themselves in that orbit.
Yes, and you can see why, which is the reason why I asked you that final question. Paul, thank you so much. Paul,
thank you so much.
No, thank you, and I direct people towards Tortoise.